Those of you who watch this channel know that I am very critical of Kyle Kulinski of Secular Talk. As much as I disagree with him, there are actually times when he and I are on the same page. For example, I think he's completely right about the war on drugs. He's well aware of what happens when you make certain commodities illegal, and he's even a little more grounded in terms of trade-offs with drug legalization in a way that some of my fellow libertarians are not.
You know, when it comes to social issues, I'm super libertarian, and I believe in freedom, and I believe in you should basically be able to do whatever you want to do as long as you're not hurting anybody else. And I think if we actually wanted to abide by that principle, we would move in that direction. With most drugs, I don't think the psychological or the societal, I should say, downsides of these drugs being legal, I don't think that outweighs what it is with them illegal. So in other words, we have more problems associated with all these drugs when drugs are illegal, because then all these drugs go to the black market. When they're on the black market, there's a giant spike in crime. There's a giant spike in mafia activity, so organized crime. Violence shoots through the roof. So the way that you get rid of the violent crime aspect of this stuff is to legalize, tax, and regulate drugs, because then you wipe out the black market. And when you wipe out the black market, the criminals are not in the market. So it's much better to go to a safe store with a security guard and people wearing suits and ties and, you know, go get your drugs that way than go to some back alley where there's somebody laying there on the ground who OD'd and somebody waiting to rob you right around the corner. So, I mean, this stuff is relatively obvious, and we learn from prohibition, but we still have prohibition with most drugs. So that makes no sense.
Will legalization increase drug use and many of the problems associated with that? Yes, probably so. But on the whole, I believe that we will be better off. In particular, legalization is the best way to reduce violence associated with the black markets that currently supply drugs. More important than anything, as far as I'm concerned, this is your liberty. You should be free to alter your conscience in whatever way you want, as long as you're not directly hurting anyone else. That said, for every issue where I agree with Kyle, there are at least a dozen where I think he's completely wrong. For example, let's take a look at his support for Bernie Sanders and AOC's new bill to cap interest rates at 15%.
Capping interest rates at 15% makes sense, and it's not even close. It's obviously the right thing to do. It stops usury. It basically stops loan sharking, and this is the kind of stuff where big financial institutions screw regular people, and it's not their fault.
First, like the war on drugs, there is the liberty argument. I hate to be a bore, but yes, I do think that you should be free to engage in transactions on the best terms you can negotiate. Amazingly, Kyle is for the legalization of euthanasia, which I am too, by the way, but he thinks that the government needs to protect you from taking out a high-interest loan.
Amazing!
But since the liberty argument is so unpersuasive to most people, let's talk about practicality. Financial institutions don't simply make up interest rates they charge out of thin air. The interest rate that a person is given on borrowed money is determined by a number of factors. One of those factors is the risk that the financial institution is taking by lending that money out. The financial institution determines this based on things like income, credit history, and collateral. Generally speaking, the more a financial institution believes that it will be paid back in full, the lower the interest rate it is willing to give out. Conversely, if a financial institution believes it is less likely to be paid back, it assigns a higher interest rate. The higher risk of default has to be justified by the greater reward. So, what will happen if you cap interest rates at 15%? Well, we don't know exactly. But we do know that, assuming nothing else changes, the risk a financial institution takes on when loaning money out to an individual doesn't change. Meaning, somebody doesn't all of a sudden become more trustworthy just because you cap interest rates. The fact of the matter is that there are certain people, whether it's because they have bad credit, no collateral, or too low of an income, that financial institutions will not lend to below a 15% interest rate. They're simply not willing to take the risk on these people without greater potential for reward. So, if you cap interest rates, financial institutions will not all of a sudden loan to these people at lower rates. They will simply not lend to them at all. And how will the now would-be borrowers react to their inability to get a loan? That's hard to say. According to our friends on the left, a good deal of the American population is quite vulnerable to financial emergencies.
78% of the American people are still living paycheck to paycheck. 50% of wage earners in this country make $30,000 a year or less. 44 million Americans don't even have health insurance. Also, 44 million Americans have $1.3 trillion in student loan debt. 40% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency.
Where will these people go when they desperately need to borrow money? Well, historically speaking, and much like when you make certain substances illegal, people will go to the black market. The places where usury laws are implemented don't get rid of loan sharks. They simply create violent ones.
These are some pages from the loan book of a Glasgow loan shark, and it's kind of interesting to see how the business model works. You lend out maybe £10 to someone and you expect to be paid back £12.50 at the end of the week. Now that's 25% a week, but if you work that out as an annual rate, it comes to 11 million percent.
So why do people scraping by on just £5.90 a day pay such horrendous interest on loans? These surely are loans you'd be mad not to default on. Here in Glasgow, defaulting on your loan is highly inadvisable. You won't literally lose a pound of flesh, but grievous bodily harm isn't an unknown consequence of letting down the loan shark. Quite simply, individual loan sharks have to be rapacious and ruthless because the costs to them of even a single defaulter are so high. And that explains why, from Renaissance Italy to modern Scotland, the moneylender is so often a hated figure.
Organized crime doesn't just deal in illegal substances. In fact, one of their original sources of money is high-interest loans. Much like payday loan stores, they charge extremely high interest rates. But unlike their white market competition, they respond to delinquency with violence. I do not envy anyone desperate enough to go to a payday lender. The people who patronize these establishments are likely to be in very rough shape financially already. But like the war on drugs, we have to deal with the world as it is and accept that different approaches come with different trade-offs. Payday loan companies and other financial institutions that lend money out aren't always the most ethical businesses. Everybody knows that. However, if you owe them money and you can't pay it back, you have options. These institutions have to deal with the law, and according to the law, there's not a whole lot they can do when people stop paying them back.
From 1996 to 2006, there were between 1 and 2 million bankruptcy cases a year in the United States, nearly all of them involving individuals who elected to go bust rather than meet their obligations. In medieval Italy, or in the Glasgow of my youth for that matter, bankruptcy was seen as a disaster. But not here.
In fact, this ability to walk away unscathed from unsustainable debt and start all over again has been a defining characteristic of American capitalism. There were no debtors' prisons here in the early 1800s, at a time when English debtors could languish in jail for years. Since 1898, every American has been entitled to file for Chapter 7, liquidation, or Chapter 13, voluntary personal reorganization. For rich and poor alike, bankruptcy has become as much of an inalienable right as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Should the debtor go through the bankruptcy process, the lender is not even allowed to contact them. Furthermore, most Americans who enter the bankruptcy process get rid of almost all of their debt without having their assets seized or their payments rescheduled. Of course, there are incentives against the debtor doing this. Financial institutions may not be able to collect on their debts, and they certainly can't hurt you physically, but they can destroy your reputation. That's all your credit score is, after all, a number representing how trustworthy of a borrower you are. This isn't perfect by any means, but it's much better than the alternative. Payday lenders are the alternative to the loan shark. This is how we settle our differences with them. In court, wearing suits and ties, not with guns. For the debtor, obviously having bad credit sucks, but it's a lot better than having Tony Soprano come and break your kneecaps because you didn't pay up.